From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Tori Maguire and it's Friday, June 18. Prime Minister Scott Morrison spent the past week on the diplomatic stage in the Northern Hemisphere. So in the latest round of polling from our new Resolve Political Monitor, we asked Australian voters for their views on some of the most pressing global issues the government has to navigate in coming months. The results, as always, were fascinating. To discuss, I'm joined by our pollster, the Director of Resolve Strategic, Jim Reid. Welcome back to Please Explain, Jim.
Hi, Tori.
This is the third month that we have published the Resolve Political Monitor, which is our new polling for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. And I have to say, Jim, it's established itself in the conversation very, very quickly. Monday night was funny. I got a lot of messages from people who were absolutely dying to know what they were going to see in the interactive that we put live at 8 o'clock on Tuesday morning. Hasn't taken long for them to become quite addicted to it.
There's a lot of political tragics out there, I think.
Yeah. There's a lot to get through today because we managed to get a lot of stories out of this month's survey. But just quickly, Jim, we'll start with the main political figures. Scott Morrison saw a sizable decline in his favourables this month. What does that mean?
We've seen a few trends this month at a federal level in our usual political measures. And really, they're all about the coalition, the government at the moment. We've got those rating Morrison positively on his performance, down 5 points this month. He's still the preferred PM, but they also, our respondents have rated the government 6 or 7 points lower on things like handling of COVID, health and aged care, and also focus as well. So it's really all pointing to the last month. Coupled with the verbatim comments that inform this, it's really a reflection, I think, of the vaccine rollout, both generally and in aged care, and also the handling of quarantine as well. If you think back to 2020, when we were buying multiple vaccines, we were the first to close borders, we were doing innovative things like hotel quarantine and building ventilators. It all seems a little bit more reactive now.
The interesting thing, Jim, though, is even though the government was rated down on these things this month, it really hasn't impacted people's voting intention.
That's right. I mean, we use primary vote only. We don't use TPP, our two-party preferred, because that tells us the relative health of the parties, including minor parties and independents. And because it's a behaviour rather than a view, it tends to stay quite stable. And that's true here as well. The coalition are on 40% and Labour on 36%. They haven't changed significantly. But over the 3 monthly tracks, we have seen both major parties gaining 1 or 2 points each every month. And that's a clear sign to me that the contest is sharpening a little bit. And that previously sort of parked vote with minor parties and particularly independents who aren't known at the moment is beginning to peel away and go back to the major parties.
So, Jim, I want to get into the issues questions because we had a couple of really fascinating issues to discuss this month. Let's start by talking about climate change. Scott Morrison is on his way home now from being a guest at the G7 summit in Cornwall in the UK, where we all thought that climate change would be big on the agenda and that he would be given quite a hard time about Australia's refusal to sign up to net zero emissions by 2050. And also that we have no plans here in Australia to impose a carbon tax. So we asked voters about their views on this. What did they say?
Yeah, I guess the G7 and NATO and other things were a little bit more about China than they were about climate. But we still asked people about emissions and climate change. And Australians certainly aren't averse to a 2050 net zero target at all. We've got just 12% opposed to that sort of target, and that's quite consistent across all the voting blocks and states and so on. We've got, in fact, 55% supporting that, but I think it's somewhat interesting that 28% are weak supporters within that 55%, and we've got a further third who are neutral. So it's a support, but kind of a weak support, if you like. And I think a great deal of that is that people are convinced of climate change. You know, back in the early 2000s, I used to poll whether people had ever heard of global warming or whether they believed in it. And I think those days are gone. Everyone is convinced of that argument, or the vast majority of are. And we're constantly being told that urgent action is required. So when they see a target that's, nigh on 30 years off, and we don't really need to take any action for 20, 25 years to get there, they're actually often want more urgent action. I think that's actually reinforced when we split the question and ask people to prioritise either the new 2050 target or existing 2030 targets. We actually get more people going for that latter target. So that's telling us that people want governments to be doing something sooner rather than later.
The big question is what government should be doing. Jim, you asked voters whether they preferred the option of allowing technology and investment in technology to reduce emissions, or, on the other hand, having a carbon tax. Now, we should acknowledge that it is potentially possible to do both. But for the purposes of this poll, which do people prefer? And overwhelmingly, people said they wanted to rely on technology.
That's right. We had 61% opting for achieving emissions reductions of any level via technology. And we had just 13% favouring putting a price on carbon, and that might be a tax or an emissions trading scheme or whatever. So that aligns very strongly, actually, with the government's sort of mantra of technology, not taxes. But I think that prejudice in the population is partly a fact of Australians have been burnt by those taxes before. We had that to and fro in the late 2000s that essentially put emissions policy back a decade. It resulted in political instability, and many don't welcome extra taxes at the moment anyway. Cost of living is a big issue. And I think instead they've seen how solar panels have worked, how batteries have worked. They've got that home experience. They've seen electric cars coming online. They've seen wind farms. They've even seen gas-fired backup power in the recent Upper Hunter election. I think they want that positive action, that very practical action, to be repeated and expanded.
Yeah. It's funny, though. One of my colleagues said on Twitter, if Australians want net zero by 2050 but don't want a carbon tax, it's like saying, I want my bowl of ice cream, but I want to stay slim.
Diet ice cream, I think, is the answer.
Yeah, exactly. Jim, finally, I just want to talk to you about the issue of China, because that is actually the issue that dominated the G7, partially thanks to Scott Morrison's kind of intervention to put the conversation on that front. He turned up at the G7 determined to talk about Australia's troubles with China, not climate change. What do Australians think about the Australian government's handling of that issue?
Well, this poll was taken just before the G7 and the NATO meeting, of course, so it doesn't factor that in, that agreement amongst allies. But even before that, the results on Australia's relations with China in this research are basically saying that Australia supports the government actions to date, things like calling for an investigation into the Wuhan source of COVID, taking China to the WTO on trade restrictions, cancelling Victoria's Belt and Road deal, looking into the Darwin port sale, etc., all got very strong support. I think it would be easy to misinterpret that as Australia being anti-China. I don't think that's the case. I think when we say China, and sometimes I know media say Chinese as well, what we're actually talking about is the Chinese government and their actions, not the people, of course. But we also find strong signs that actually Australians are quite aware of the trade benefits with China, and they do, in the main, support a quite diplomatic solution to get back where we were before. However, we get 61% supporting Australia standing up and speaking out where we need to, and only 23% think Australia should think twice about doing so in the future. And I think that prejudice to stand up to China is very clear, with most supporting further WTO action or imposing our own tariffs on China should the need arise, should China choose to escalate this further.
Jim, you've been doing polling like this for a long time. Anything in this month's track that surprised you?
I think perhaps the most surprising thing is not at the federal or a national level, but at the state level. So we've been polling, as you know, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria, over the last few months at a state level. And we reported the primary vote gain for the Berejiklian government in New South Wales last month. And that was completely in keeping with the Premier's positive profile and everything we've seen from elections in WA and Queensland and elsewhere. Incumbents have gained traction, gained seats through steering their respective states through COVID. So the surprise for me that this month we reported for the first time this year, I think, for any poll, the state level results in Victoria. And that shows a very different picture. There we have the Labor incumbent going backwards 6 points on primary vote, and a change in preference flows amongst the minor parties. So they're even more evenly split between the major parties too.
I'm sure Dan Andrews, who is still recovering from his injury and is in a lot of pain, probably didn't enjoy reading those numbers very much.
Yes, I apologise to him for that, but really we're seeing this is through the verbatim comments and the other ratings, is really a bit of a protest vote about the government. It's not an endorsement of the Liberal National opposition there, who don't gain from that vote. It's really the minor parties. And the government are really being marked down for not being better prepared on COVID and their approach to outbreak. So it seems that we've got a bit of a love-hate relationship, and that applies to Dan Andrews himself, where voters are pretty split on what they think of him.
Jim, it was a fascinating monthly result. Next month, we'll be getting into some other very juicy issues. Thanks again for joining me on Please Explain.
Thanks, Tori.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Chi Wong. The journalists, editors, producers, photographers and tech team at The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald work tirelessly to cover the news that matters. For coverage you can trust, visit our websites or buy our papers. To support our journalism, you can subscribe via our homepages or just search subscribe, The Sydney Morning Herald or The Age. I'm Tori Maguire. Thanks for listening.